clearly there's an issue with obesity and heart disease and all these issues in the States. There has to be a group of people, somebody who like can see that. But I also have to wonder if it's because there's a lot of money to be made off of medical bills.
There's different words for this. Some people call it deception. Some people call it bullshit. You gotta peel through the layers and rediscover true reality.
Yeah. Ken, I loved your book. My perspective on a lot of things in our world or realities is just, it often seems very much like we can truly create our own realities in a lot of ways. But the way that it's constructed for us is simply, if you really take a step back, the way I see it is that it's often just based in companies that are seeking profit, right? And looking to find ways to market something in the right way or tell a story the right way to get recurring, users or consumers or whatever that is. And when I read your book, I felt like there were so many points that you had in there that were really just so important to have more people know about them, because it gives light to exactly that we are kind of in my perspective, in this system that isn't actually real. It's not actually law. It's just kind of what we've been sold.
I think either way you look at it, and there's really two ways to look at it. You could look at it as in you're creating your own reality, and that works for many, many people. The way I look at it is I'm basically trying to tease through all the layers of, and there's different words for this. Some people call it, deception. Some people call it bullshit. Just to kind of peel through the layers and rediscover true reality.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, that model works much better. And when I first started my medical practice, I noticed that I would be taught things by my professors in medical school or residency, or I would read a journal article, and it would just occur to me, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But I was busy. I was learning. I was growing in practice. I didn't have time to really sit down and do research, but I would kind of file that away, because there are things in medicine that don't make sense, but yet are true. And so you always have to be on the lookout. Maybe this is one of those things where it just sounds completely backwards.
That's a good point.
But it's actually, that's the way it works.
Yeah.
And there are many cases in physiology where our initial understanding of them was exactly backwards to what the physiology wound up being. And so I would just file these little things away. And one of the very first things that I filed away was that, if you have diverticulosis, you should avoid eating nuts and seeds because they will cause diverticulitis. And just my country boy common sense brain went, but we've been eating nuts and seeds a long damn time. When did they start causing diverticulitis? Maybe, but I don't know. And so years later, when I actually had accumulated quite a few of these little nuggets of distruth, I started looking into this, and I found that when you start looking into the research backing such claims as that, very often you find nothing whatsoever. Or you'll find that one Harvard professor, a gray-haired old white man, said this one time, and it literally became the law.
Yeah.
There was no research, there was no study, it just that. And so in the case of men, will know the expression that taking testosterone is like throwing gasoline on a fire when it comes to the prostate and prostate cancer. Well, where did that come from? Is there research? I mean, that's a bold statement, so there better be robust research to support that. When you dig down to the bottom, when you rediscover the actual reality, it was a Harvard professor who said that. And literally there's no research to prove that whatsoever. And so it's just basically a list of those types of things that I encountered early in my medical practice. And I was like, I got to look into this because this doesn't make any sense.
It's funny. I'm big on listening to podcasts. They have all of this information coming out about ancient Egypt too. That's been like lining our textbooks for years, right? Giving us more or less our timeline for history that we've all known. And to your point, they're finding like just so much of it is actually one person who is guarding that information for their life, because they spent their entire life constructing that as the truth. And they thought, at the time they were doing the right thing. But can you imagine like spending your entire, let's say 60-year career really thinking you came up with the answer, and then you find that it's not true. And I think that's what's been happening in medicine too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like we should talk about the 7-country study. I think that's something a lot of people should know about, that you talk about in depth. That everybody read the book because it's crazy. But yeah, let's talk on that. Maybe with cholesterol and fat.
Sure. Yep. So a fish biologist by the name of Ansel Keys firmly believed that saturated fat caused heart disease. He believed that. And I think that he honestly believed that. I think when he set out to do this study, he meant to do good for the world. I don't think he was trying to trick or deceive at all. But that's actually often more dangerous than if you're trying to be deceptive, because very often if you're trying to be deceptive, your deception will be found out. But this guy was earnest. He was honest. He believed this. And so he set out to do this huge study. And he wound up getting data from 21 or 22 different countries. But he found that the research from only 6 or 7 of the countries actually supported his belief. And so he whittled he didn't call it the 22 country study. He called it the 7 countries of the 6. And so he just pushed to the side all of that research that did not support his hypothesis that eating saturated fat increases your risk of heart disease. Now, I don't think he was trying to trick anybody. I think he probably thought there's probably some problem with the data from those countries. Maybe Gerald, that other researcher, was the guy that collected that, and I don't really trust him, whatever the reason. But he did not include all the data in his study. And so when he published this study, not only was he a very intelligent guy, and he actually has done some good research, some of which was suppressed for years before it came to light, and he got this study published, and he was a very forceful guy, very outspoken, very boisterous, and some would say overbearing. And so anybody who would challenge him on his hypothesis, he would either in print or in person or on the airwaves, he would just eviscerate them. And so it got to the point nobody was going to take a chance to stand up against Ansel, because they knew that he would spill your guts on television and not think twice about it. And so, he was a very respected researcher and did a lot of good work. And so this just became the dogma that eating saturated fat increases your risk of heart disease. And tied into that story is about the same time President Eisenhower had a heart attack. And so immediately Ansel Keys was helping the first doctor to change his diet and get all the bacon and the egg yolks out of his diet. Yeah. Now, nobody mentioned the fact that he smoked 2 or 3 packs of, I think, unfiltered cigarettes a day. That wasn't really because nobody back then thought that smoking was bad for you. Many doctors believed it was good for you. And so this became the dogma. And so Ansel Keys, I think, was earnest and honest. But once this caught on, and then when we get to the 1977 dietary guidelines,
yeah,
and this was basically not made into law in the United States, but was made regulatory in nature. So basically anybody in prison or in the armed forces, in school lunches, cafeterias, in the hospital, they were going to eat this diet that was recommended by the guidelines. They had to, because that was the only thing that was offered. If the institution didn't give them that, they'd lose their funding. Now you can say, okay, well, this has pretty much been almost codified in law. Now, just imagine if you were Nabisco or Kellogg's, and you're like, well, crap, okay, so we can't make stuff out of saturated fat. So that pretty much rules out animal products to make stuff with. But, they don't have a long shelf life anyway. But what if we used wheat or rice or oats or corn, because they've got a super long shelf life once you process them. And then we'll add some salt, of course, make it taste better. And then we'll use some cottonseed oil or some corn oil or some canola oil, because that's got a really long half-life and it's very low in saturated fat. So no one made Kellogg's and Mondelez and all these huge corporations. No one made them or paid them to make these highly processed foods that are basically some conglomeration of grains vegetable seed oils, and sugar. That was just the sweet spot. Based on the guidelines, they could make that stuff super cheap. It was shelf stable, and they could make a huge 1,000% markup on it. So of course, that's what they did. You can't make 1,000% markup on bacon. Plus, you can't keep it in the warehouse 6 months and then keep it on the store shelf another 6 months because it'll go moldy, and rats will break in and eat it because it's real food. Whereas the other stuff can sit on the shelf for a year or two and it seems seemingly still fresh. And so I think it was just this conglomeration of just so events that led us to what we now have and now know as the standard American diet.
And that, I think that was in, I can't remember if it was before 1978, right? It was like the 50s.
Yeah, when he was doing his research and this was becoming well known, it was well before the 77 guidelines.
Yeah.
And so by the time McGovern decided to do this thing in Congress, this was already the established science. Every university professor would say, yeah, you need to avoid saturated fat. And again, nobody had done, well, actually, there were 3 randomized controlled trials done in human beings that replaced saturated animal fat with vegetable oils. There's actually been 3 very well done, long-term randomized controlled trials in humans where we did that. And in all 3 cases, it wound up doing harm. They had more heart attacks, they had more strokes, they died prematurely. But one of those studies was actually done by Ansel Keys, the Minnesota Heart Study. And it was not published for years. And then when it finally was published, it was published in some obscure Scandinavian journal that nobody reads. And so because it just didn't support the hypothesis. And nobody wanted to go against Ansel Keys or the mainstream belief at that time. There's the Sydney Heart Study replaced saturated animal fat with corn oil. Mm-hmm. And one of them was double blinded. So the researchers nor the participants knew if they were getting corn oil or animal fat. They went on for years, one 3 years, one 8 years, very long time. They had a very large number of participants, and these participants were inpatients, either in a mental ward or some hospital setting, so that they were observed. So this is like the penultimate research in should we replace animal fat with vegetable oil. And it all 3 times it failed miserably. If you tell the average doctor, who also, like Ansel Keys, means well, has a good heart, is trying to help people, if the average doctor's saying you need to eat a plant-based diet, don't eat bacon, don't eat egg yolks, and you say to them, do you realize that there are 3 large randomized controlled trials in humans that prove that what the advice you're giving right now is harmful. You're doing harm by giving that advice. That doctor would be blown away. They'd be like, you're full of crap. There's no way. No, I would know that if those studies were out there. But they are out there. But they're just not talked about. This is one of the many things that's not picked up and talked about by mainstream media. And it wasn't back in the 70s and 80s either, because who are their biggest advertisers?
Right.
Who pays their expenses? Kellogg's, Post, General Mills, Heinz, Kraft Heinz. That's who pays for the ads. You don't see the Bacon Council and the Beef Council. You don't see them buying $10 million spots on the Super Bowl. It's the processed food manufacturers who've got the money to spend, and that's who spends the money. And so just, again, put yourself, you're a publisher of a big magazine, and you just found out about these 3 studies, and you're going to publish a huge expose. Well, your editors are going to look at that before you publish it. And they're probably going to call a few of them, be like, gee, this feels like it steps on some toes. And they're going to call some ad sponsors and say, hey, we're about to run this story. What do you think Kellogg's is going to say? What do you think Kraft Heinz is going to say? They're going to say, yeah, go ahead and run that. We'll pull all our ads.
Yep.
And we'll never advertise with you again. And so you just literally cut your advertising budget by 30%, 50% by running that one story that would have saved many, many lives, but it will cost you your job and perhaps cost the magazine a bankruptcy. What are you going to do? And so I think people every day, from the doctor to the patient to everybody in between, are faced with these conundrums, faced with these dilemmas. Like, well, I know this is right, but man, if I do it, it's going to cause a lot of downstream effects. A lot of dominoes are going to be knocked over. is it worth it? Or could I do something that's a little less right, but still not wrong,
Right.
and that be okay, and I'll be able to live with myself and sleep at night? And the average person is like, yeah, I'm going to do the things that's a little less right, but that's not going to knock all the dominoes down.
Yeah, and something I'm always curious about too, Ken, like maybe this kind of a loaded question, but maybe it's not. I don't know. Why was the blanking on his name, the Seven Countries guy? What was his name?
Ansel.
Yeah, Ansel.
Ansel. Mm-hmm.
Why was he so guarded? Was he being paid by who? Right? Like, what was?
That's the thing, and that's what makes this so insidious.
Yeah.
Is when he initially began this research, I don't think he was being paid by anybody.
Right.
Now I could be wrong, but I think that he believed this. I think that he was trying to do what he thought was right. I think he was trying to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
I think he probably had he was a little megalomaniacal, and he thought he was going to save the world with his research. I think that's what was going on. And then by the time that more research was coming out, it was already too late, because as you intimated earlier, he'd already been doing this for 20 years. And basically his reputation was built on saturated fat is bad for your heart.
Okay.
So it's much easier, I think, for people now to flip-flop than it was back then. You couldn't flip-flop back then, because, it wasn't like, oh, well, I'll have to take down that Instagram video if I flip-flop on this issue. Back then it was like, okay, I'll have to go and grab every copy of every book that's ever been published and every magazine article. There's, 80 million of these different things in print. I'm going to look like a fool.
Right.
If I go, well, I thought that was right, but I've changed my mind now. And there just wasn't a lot of that going on back then. And I suspect that later on in his career, he was probably either directly or indirectly subsidized by corporate friends, shall we say. Right. But initially, I'll bet you, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I'll bet you he just thought he was doing the right thing. He was just incorrect.
Yeah, there was the milk topic that you brought up as well was similar to this. More or less, the Got Milk campaigns really fueled this. From my understanding, milk actually caught its wind in sales when it was, I think, post World War One. From what I remember, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I thought it was that there wasn't enough food for soldiers overseas. So then the government was flushing like powdered milk over there to give them food and calories. And then as a result, there was kind of a surplus of dairy in the States. And so they started flooding advertising really with milk and making it desirable for particularly women to give to babies, and then for people to have for strong bones and to prevent from having height and all the things, right? And so that's when all of that started happening. And then I think I read, and I could be wrong about this, but that's when stuffed crust came about too, because there was a surplus then in the market of milk. So they needed to figure out where to put this milk. And then that's where the Got Milk campaigns come out about the benefits. And that's the key point is, right, like the so-called benefits of drinking milk. But from my research, when I was looking into this, it looks like the actual inverse of that. In fact, a lot of people who drink milk, a huge proportion of them find that it's not actually beneficial. It might even cause them harm. They found that there are weaker bones for 30-year-long studies of people that they followed who would have milk versus those that didn't. And all the other things that, come back to just showing that this has so much to do with advertising, but also interest by the government to win a war, which is understandable. But then it's like, right, at a certain point, like that's where where's the line? It doesn't exist, it seems.
No, it doesn't exist. It's a fluid line. It changes constantly. It changes based on who's got the most money, who's got the most power, who's in office. But the whole topic of milk is fascinating. And so initially, say around the turn of the century, right? Not this last one, but the one before that. Right. Especially in larger cities like Chicago and New York, the milk was severely adulterated. And so I think for young children under the age of 5, 6, or 7, drinking milk, unless they have a specific allergy to the casein or the whey, I think it's very nutritious and very healthy. We can get into more about the milk if you want to, but after the age of 7 or 8, virtually everyone loses their lactase persistence, and virtually everyone becomes more inflamed by the caseins and the whey. But so if you were a small poor child in New York City around the turn of the 1900s, your mom would buy you milk because even then they believed milk was a healthy food, and I think for kids it is. And so every step along the supply, from the dairy farmer to the transporter to the middleman to the grocery store owner, they would all cut the milk a little bit. They would add some water and add some plaster of Paris because that's cheaper than milk, right? And so also they could transport less milk, and transportation costs is a big deal back then, especially. So they would buy a half gallon of milk, and by the time they got finished with adulterating it, it was a gallon. And so they made this huge markup, but the kids were getting severely sick. Plus, a lot of the dairies, especially around Chicago area, were not taking good care of the cattle. There was rampant tuberculosis infection in the cattle and thus in the milk. And so children were actually getting sicker from drinking milk than from not drinking milk. And that's why the federal government initially decided to act and put down some laws about milk. And that's really the seed corn from where the pasteurization and the homogenation and it's all got to go in the same vat. It's got to be heated up. It's got to be messed with. We got to add vitamin D2, not D3. But initially it was a good thing that they were doing because people were killing children with this adulterated, infected milk back in the day. In the big cities. Now, if you lived out on the farm and you had a dairy cow, then that raw milk was until you were at 5, 6, or 7, that was a gift from the Creator.
Right.
Absolutely. It was great for you. But the milk that the inner city children were getting was devastatingly unhealthy. And so the federal government decided to act, which that sounds like a good thing and probably was initially. But now it's turned into the point where you can literally go to jail now for buying or selling raw milk in many states in the United States. It's ridiculous, right? If raw milk is handled properly, it is probably healthier than the homogenized, pasteurized supermarket milk, and is very, very safe. But that echo of the thing that happened in the distant past, plus the laws that are now on the books, and it's very hard to get a law off the books. That's why you got to be careful about putting laws on the books, because it's hard to get them off. And now we're stuck with all these guidelines and regulations about raw milk, which are foolish if people are handling the raw milk properly. And so that you're right. It's another great example of how in trying to do good, we wound up bastardizing this very nutritious drink for children who are still growing and developing. And now we've basically turned it into a barren food product.
Yeah, and it seems like you sort of touched on the wheat part before too, how wheat became part of everything because it's cheaper and it lasts, and it can be in cookies and it can be in pizzas and pretty much everything that you can sell at a pretty cheap price, similar to some other stuff that we'll talk, like seed oils and those kinds of things too, right? But you look at this and you think, okay, clearly there's an issue with obesity and heart disease and all these issues in the States. There has to be a group of people, somebody who like can see that and can also, like you have, connect the dots, right? And be like, all right, maybe this was incorrect. But you still see like the Got Milk campaigns, it's like crazy. You still see it. You still see all the stuff for wheat. And it's almost like they're so interconnected financially at this point that's the big problem, is like now at this point it's nefarious because there is truth out there, but they're refusing to share that information. I almost wonder in part, number one being because the financials are so interconnected, but I also have to wonder if it's, and I'm not saying this is what I think, I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised if it was also because there's a lot of money to be made off of medical bills. And that's a reality.
Yeah,
it's a business.
And whether that is a fortunate consequence for them or whether that is somehow baked into the pie, I don't know. I don't think we know the answer to that. But there's an increasing number of people out there who think that, big food, big pharma, one gives you they sell you the problem,
yep.
Then the other sells you the solution, And it sure feels like a merry-go-round, doesn't it?
Totally.
And I can't fault people who think that way, but at the same time, as trying to be somewhat scientific in my thinking, I always have to think about Occam's razor and what's the one simple explanation for this. And in very many cases, it's just ignorance. And in many other cases, it's just greed. And when you combine those two, or when you combine somebody who is sophomoric, so they sound like they know what they're talking about, but they basically know just enough to be dangerous. Mm-hmm. And then there's some money to be made. Again, that's a dangerous combination. Either at an influencer level or at a CEO level, that's very, very dangerous because they're going to make bad decisions based on the financials.
Sure.
And they don't know enough to think deeply about the long-term ramifications of changing the diet, of changing the quality of the nutrition that you're feeding people. They don't understand that you're not going to kill people overnight.
Yeah.
But what about in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? How many grandmothers and grandfathers are going to die prematurely? How many mothers and fathers are going to have a heart attack in their 40s or 50s? How many children are going to be orphaned by this? I mean, they don't think like that because, the pessimist among us would say, yeah, they don't think like that because that's not going to blow back on them. Because you really can't sue them for that kind of stuff because there's so many other variables. And that's true. But at the same time, I think that they're able to justify it by saying, well, people are going to smoke, they're going to do whatever, they're going to drive fast, whatever.
Right.
It's not my problem. I'm just selling a product. If you don't want it, don't buy it. And I totally get that logic. I believe in capitalism. But at the same time, there are shortcuts you can take, and there are collaborations that you can do that are very remunerative. Mm-hmm. And so at every level, from the tiniest Instagram influencer all the way up to the CEO of Kellogg's, if you sell out enough little times, you basically cannot wind up being an effective human who can make the world a better place. And I think that happens every day, and it's very sad, but it's very common.
Yeah, it's back to ego too, right? The human ego is it's a real huge, powerful thing that can be really great and can be really bad too. And I'm like you, capitalism, we can make YouTube videos and have these kinds of conversations in large part because of capitalism. It's a beautiful thing in a lot of ways. But yes, it does seem like we've lost our way in a lot of ways. And there's been too much ego involved. And the most recent thing too that I was curious of your input on is the food compass that came out. Yeah. In my opinion, it's one of the most blatant displays of just the problem, really, of the fact that so much of what we're told is false. And also, if you look at how that type of information is used, sure, maybe the average person out there doesn't really care or look at it, but that's what is then deemed worthy to go into public schools. And that's what you can then by code put in like poorer neighborhoods, for example, or median level neighborhoods, which keeps people poor, and it's almost keeping them in prison or in jail in a sense without actually doing it. Humans are flawed, and there could be people that have alternative agendas there. Who knows, right? But that's the thing that I think that I didn't understand for so long. And so any way you cut that compass, in my opinion, the average person isn't going to look at that chart and really dive into it. They're going to look at the ranking from top to bottom and see green, yellow, and red, and that's what that is. So I would be curious about your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think my opinion probably echoes yours very closely. The Tough School of Nutrition is where the food compass came from, and it's not some people are saying it's the new food pyramid. But you have to be careful saying things like that because that's not the terminology they're using, and therefore people can say, oh, you don't even know what you're talking about. It's not a pyramid, right? It's the food compass. Okay, whatever. So, but I think this is another great example of human nature. So the researchers at Tufts University, does anybody really believe that these guys are mean and evil daddy warbucks who are just you pay me the money and I'll say whatever? No, I don't think so. I think they mean well. I think they're trying to do a good job. But I think each and every one of them still hears the echo of the lie in their mind that saturated fat in your diet is bad, right? You can even see that echoing even today into the food compass. And indeed, that's why foods like egg yolks and red meat get such low scores, because they're very high in saturated fat. And it's like, dude, how many times does it have to be disproven that eating saturated fat in your diet does not increase your risk of heart attack? How many times has that got to be proven before you can get the echo of the lie out of your head? And I don't know what that number is, but it must be really high, because they can't seem to get it out of their head. And so I think that at each step along the way, did Kellogg's have some input into this? Maybe. But I don't think the researchers just said, look, we're going to put Fruit Loops at the top. I don't give a damn what anybody says. Kellogg's wrote me a check for $800,000 and everybody can kiss my ass. That's Fruit Loops at the top. That's it. I don't think that's how it was done. But if you tweak the inputs, just a little here and a little there, then you wind up with something like ground beef getting a score of 30.
Yeah.
Right? And then, but if you tweak it just right and tweak everything and be like, well, Fruit Loops are very low in sodium. And Fruit Loops they have no saturated fat. And they have no cholesterol. And they're fortified with some vitamins. Therefore, they wind up with an 80, 85 on this score.
Yeah.
And if this food compass is adopted by the federal government, I don't think it'll be much worse than the current MyPlate guidelines or the food pyramid before that. It's going to be basically more of the same. It'll just be a new package to put the same old turd in my opinion. And so effectively, people who have jobs and pay their way, they don't understand this, and it's a little bit insensitive. So if there are millions of people in this country, in the United States alone, where they have to have government assistance currently to eat. If they're in a nursing home, that nursing home is going to follow the MyPlate guidelines. And then if the food compass is accepted, they'll follow that. And so if you live in that nursing home, you've either got to have a family member who will bring you 3 meals a day, or you're going to eat the food compass. That's what's going to happen. You've got no choice in the matter, right? Same goes for kids in school, kids in preschool, anybody who works at a hospital. If you're going to eat at the cafeteria, you're going to eat the food compass. You have no choice in that matter. Every patient in the hospital, they're going to eat the food compass unless they're wealthy enough and connected enough to have somebody bring them outside food.
Right.
They're going to eat the food compass. And so what it amounts to is that, okay, so for example, on the WIC program, Women's, Infants, and Children, you can't buy red meat with your WIC benefits. You can't.
Wow.
It's not even allowed at all. And that's been that way for decades. And I think just as the decades go by with government, and anytime somebody's trying to make rules for everybody else, a little bad keeps slipping in with each turn of the wheel. And then by the time the wheel reaches the destination, there's so much bad in it that very often it's more bad than good left. And the food compass is very concerning because it gives this green light, yellow light, red light. And if somebody's not a nutritionist, just somebody on the street, and they pick up this package of Oreo cookies and it's got a green label on it, they're going to be like, booyah,
Good to
there
go.
we go.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, good. And let's see, I'll get this skim milk. Yep, it's got a green. Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's it. I've got my dinner. Not realizing that that's not what it means at all. But what do you expect the average person who drives to think a green light means?
Yeah.
It means it's safe, good, proceed. That's what that means. And so it's either nefarious on a level that you and I probably can't comprehend, or it's just a conglomeration of multiple errors that have magnified themselves until we've gotten to this place where pretty much everything is a mess.
Yeah, and I really actually appreciate your take on it too, because it is easy to like villainize and make a bad guy and all those things. And if you do that, you're considered a conspiracy theorist, and there's all those things that come with that. And even as far as like big pharma could be concerned too, which is a whole other world. But I did have some questions that I wanted to ask you that some of the people on my channel did want to know more about.
Sure.
So, I'm certainly not a medical doctor. I'd rather ask the pros like yourself. So I've got about 15 of them. So we can fly through kind of, nothing crazy fast, but I suppose your best whack at it as we go. First one is, and I know your approach is carnivore is the way to go. There are others out there,
me,
like,
personally.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And there's others like Sean Baker, who's kind of more like loose with it, whatever works for you. And then Paul Salandino, who's adamant about including fruit for electrolytes. And so in a couple sentences, for those of us that aren't as scientifically well-rounded as you are, why do you think fruit is bad?
Well, I don't necessarily think fruit is bad.
Okay.
But I think that too much fruit too often is going to be a net negative for your health. And there's multiple reasons. I agree with Paul Saladino partly on the fruit issue. I think that the fruit of the plant is the part of the plant that the plant does not mind if you eat, because they're basically seed dispersal units. If you take the fruit to eat it, then you're going to scatter the seeds, and that's going to help the plant. So I think he's right that fruits are much less inflammatory than other parts of the plant. And so that's true. I think that's totally true. But just inflammation is not the only thing we have to worry about. We also have to worry about the total carbohydrate count, because there are many of us who fatten very easily. I'm one of those people. And if I eat too many carbohydrates, they can be the cleanest, purest carbohydrates on the planet, non-GMO, organic, blah, 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 blah. If I eat too many carbs, my belly's going to start to pooch. That's just how it's going to be. And so I have to keep my carbohydrate intake very, very low to keep my hemoglobin A1C normal and to keep my belly flat, both of which I like. Okay, so I want to keep them that way. And for me, too much fruit and honey would absolutely cause those things to no longer be the case, which I'm not okay with. And I think many other people are in that same boat. If someone's always been slender, like Paul has his entire life, you might be able to tolerate more fruit. And I think that's fine. On the proper human diet spectrum that I talk about, it ranges anywhere from 100 total grams of carbohydrates a day. Some people can tolerate that fine. And if you want that to be fruit and honey, that's fine, as long as you stay under your total carb count. Some of us need to be down to 50 total grams, some 20 total grams, some, like me, as close to 0 grams of carbs a day as I can get. That's where my health is the best. And so if I started eating this 100 total grams a day of organic, non-GMO, fresh squeezed, picked straight off the vine, I would have to buy new pants. These would be too small for me.
Right.
And many people are in that same boat. Now, the third thing that I think is more concerning is something I recently made a YouTube video about. You know, the hemoglobin A1C test, that checks for glycation, right?
Yeah, I saw this video.
And I had always assumed that it checked for any glycation. And so that's why anybody in my position should not ever assume. Because when I started looking into that, I found out that's absolutely not the case at all. The hemoglobin A1C test looks specifically for the glycation that occurs when a glucose molecule attaches to either a valine or a leucine. That's what the test looks for. It does not look for fructose. It does not look for galactose from dairy. Mm-hmm. It only looks for glucose amino acid linkages. That's what the test tests for. And so if you're eating hundreds of grams of fruit a day, that's going to be a lot of fructose, isn't it? That fructose is actually 7 to 10 times more glycating than glucose. Galactose from dairy is the same way. It's 7 to 10 times more glycating depending on which study you look at. So very, very much more glycating than just glucose. And the two tests that we have, the hemoglobin A1C and the fructosamine test, which has got fructose in the name, but it still doesn't check for fructose. They both check for glucose. Glycation. That's what they check for. And so many of the people that listen to Paul or just eat lots of fruit or drink fruit juice in general could have a severe degree of glycation in their cells and tissues and still have a normal A1C.
And for people that don't understand why that would be bad, right?
So what glycation in layman's terms, it's basically the gunk that builds up in the system. It gums up the system. It causes the proteins in the tissues not to perform as efficient.
Okay.
And when they get glycated enough, they just stop performing at all. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens to people with severe uncontrolled diabetes. Their cells and tissues get so glycated that they just stop functioning.
Right.
And that's why premature death is very, very common in an uncontrolled diabetic, is because of all the severe glycation. Well, what about all the fructose glycation coming from eating all this fruit and honey that no test that your doctor can order in their office, they don't have a test to check for that.
Sure.
I feel like that's probably concerning. And that's another reason that I don't eat lots of fruits and honey. We have blueberry bushes here on the farm, and in the spring for about 2 weeks out of the year, we've had blueberries. And me and Beckett and Nisha, we all eat them. And this year, Bonnie Blue will eat them too. But we have those for 2 weeks out of a 52-week year.
Yeah.
And I think that most humans have been living in such conditions for long enough, for enough thousands of generations, that we can tolerate that for a couple of months out of the year. But what winds up happening is people believe falsely, oh, fruit's good for me, fruit's healthy. So therefore, I'm going to have multiple servings of fruit every day, a fruit juice smoothie for breakfast. I'm going to drink fruit juice with every meal. And they wind up severely glycating cells and tissues that could lead to severe dysfunction and severe disease a few years down the road.
Okay. Yeah, it's like we used to have more seasonality to our foods. Everything was seasonal for the most part, except for certain areas, but maybe they adapted to that. So let's say somebody was an active athlete, very active, right? Maybe they're a power lifter, they run, I run trails all the time. I ran 4 miles today, but let's say somebody who, 14, those kinds of numbers.
Sure.
Lifting, trying to gain weight and muscle. It sounds like you're on the edge of, whatever works for you within 100 grams of carbs, more or less. Would that be something that you would say, I guess, to answer that for those athletes who want to perform and have those kinds of results?
Yeah, so let me be very clear about the 100 total grams.
Yeah.
I think that's the maximum that anybody can tolerate. I think any more than that definitely is going to lead to disease. I don't think anybody on the planet needs 100 total grams a day. I'm saying some of us can get away with that.
Yeah. Okay, so you can pull it off sometimes, maybe.
But you can pull it off if you're working out for 4 hours a day and running 14 miles a day and lifting heavy. You can probably pull that off at least for a while. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's optimal for anybody on the planet. There are multiple examples of elite level athletes breaking world records, winning bodybuilding competitions, winning competitive competitions on effectively a zero carb diet. That we see more and more of this coming out all the time. Many of the carnivores, years ago, they thought they were weird. And they're like, I'm just not going to tell anybody I only eat meat and eggs because everybody will look at me funny. And so they just didn't talk about it. But now these people are saying, yeah, I've actually been doing that for 20 years and it works great. I've got a good friend who's a competitive bodybuilder who looks amazing. He makes me look like a beanpole. And he literally never eats carbs. He maybe 20 grams a day tops, max. That's it. And but he can build muscle like crazy. And he's all natural. We look at Sean Baker. This guy, I don't think has even seen a carb in 5 or 10 years. This guy's breaking records, right? He's a monster. So to say, well, you can't build muscle without carbs, I think that's demonstrably false. To say that you can't do endurance sports. We look at Zach Bitter, who the majority of his training is essentially zero carb. And then maybe during a long 100-mile race, he might use some carbs strategically because running 100 miles is a very, very unnatural thing to do. Mm-hmm. So he may need to make his diet unnatural to accommodate for that. But during his training, he's essentially zero carb to train for these events.
Yeah, it kind of seems like there's a transition phase with the carb thing. Like I know when I did my first carnivore month ever, I was running like 12 miles in the mountains and I was in the sun, in the mountains, didn't have water, didn't have electrolytes on me. I was 3-4 weeks into carnivore, no carbs at all. And I felt real sick, real shaky sick afterwards. And I think though, because I've done carnivore for a long time after that, I do think that there's a transition part with our body. If we've always had carbs, if you've always had sugar, and you've performed at that rate with those, I mean, yeah, you're gonna feel some changes, possibly.
Absolutely. I think it's just like if you took me, a Tennessee boy, and you took me to Denver and said, okay, I want you to run 10 miles at that altitude. and I had not
Yeah.
accommodated and acclimated to that, I would be suffering, and I could potentially be in trouble, right? To try to run 10 miles when I can run it effortlessly in Tennessee, but when I got to Denver at that altitude, uh-uh. I'd have to acclimate to that, and I think diet is just like altitude or anything else. Yeah, you're going to have to acclimate to that, especially if you're trying to do elite level stuff. And just for people out there, running 14 miles a day, that's elite level athletic stuff. Even if you're not winning gold medals, that's very rare that people actually do that consistently.
If somebody has low energy performing like that and fruit isn't an option, what would be a good option for that person?
More fat.
Yeah.
That's what most people notice, that when they up the fat, they have more energy, both mental energy and physical energy, and that's where I would start.
Okay. Yeah. And I know you have suggested a great way to have a food lifestyle is eggs, bacon, and beef. And
Beef, butter, bacon, and eggs.
butter, yeah. If
Yeah.
someone were to live the rest of their life with that, and getting enough fat in their day, getting enough calories, I tend to look at, I'm about 150, so I have 1.5 pounds of meat a day at minimum. Doing all of those things, do you think that that's sufficient for somebody to live the rest of their life, vitamins wise and all of that? Okay, doing a quick diversion from this interview with Dr. Ken Berry. I don't love ads myself. I know, I get it, all that, but I want to share 2 companies with you guys that I do personally actually use. I'm always talking about like buying meat in bulk because that is the most effective and cost-effective way. And the company I buy from is called Nose to Tail. Nose to Tail, you guys, I have looked a long time to find a company that has regenerative farming. They actually treat their animals nicely. The quality of the meat is grass-fed, grass-finished. It's very good. And they're actually doing good prices. I actually know them personally now. We went to dinner last weekend, so they're very trustworthy people. They provided 10% off if you use the link below. The other thing that I'm always talking about is tallow. So we always want to cook with tallow, right? If our energy is kind of low, if we're not feeling full enough, or if we're like losing too much weight, we want to add more fat to our meat. Tallow is beef fat. So we don't want to cook with Pam and all that stuff. You want to cook with tallow. The second company that I found that actually does offer tallow is called White Oak Pastures. These guys are flipping amazing, also regenerative. There's no seed oils, none of that. The price for tallow is usually between 20 to 25 bucks or so from what I've found. These guys are doing it for under 10. They also have a discount code if you use the link below. Again, use this if you want to. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. These are what I use to find success and make life easy. So I hope that this helps you guys. Let me know what you think. All right, back to the video with Dr. Ken Berry. Thanks.
Depending, but in theory, yes. But it depends on how the meat was raised. It depends on what the animal ate that produced the meat, right? Yeah. And so there's many good examples. For example, iodine. Yeah. If there's no iodine in the soil that the grass grows in, then there's no iodine in the grass that the cow eats. Then therefore there's no iodine in the ground beef that you just ate. Right. And so when it comes to elements, it's got to be in the soil. And it's also got to be accessible to the grass, or the cow's not going to have access to that, right? And so there are many minerals like that that are currently either our soils are deficient, or the mineral is locked up in the soil because of improper farming techniques where the grass can't get to it currently. And that's a problem. And so, I think ultimately when we're all regenerative ranching and we're treating the earth like it should be treated, I think absolutely you could live on beef, butter, bacon, and eggs for 50 years. Mm-hmm. And if you were close enough to an ocean so that the soil had iodine in it, you would never need to take a single supplement. You get plenty of sun and eat your meat and eat your eggs and play in the sun. Literally, you would never develop a vitamin or mineral deficiency or amino acid or fatty acid ever. Right. But currently, some of the meat is poorly raised. Some of the soil is very poorly tilled and treated. And so we have to think about those types of things. So I would say the average person now, if you wanted to eat beef, butter, bacon, and eggs for the rest of your life, you should add 2 ounces of some kind of liver twice a week. And you should eat seafood once or twice a week. And with those 2 additions, which are, say, sardines and 2 ounces of beef liver twice a week, those are both superfood multivitamins. The sardines are definitely going to have plenty of iodine from the ocean, right? Mm-hmm. And they're not going to have any of the mercury or the other toxic crap that the big fish get in them because sardines are small. That's right. And then the beef liver or the chicken liver or any liver, cod liver, that's another multivitamin. And so if you add those two things out of an abundance of caution, then yes, you could do beef, butter, bacon, and eggs, liver twice a week, just a small amount, twice a week, sardines twice a week. Literally, you could live for 100 years on that diet. Get plenty of sun, right? And you would never need to supplement a single vitamin or mineral.
And look good while you're doing it.
Look real damn good doing
It's a
it.
good perk, you know?
Yeah.
It's a great side effect. And off that, actually, I had somebody mention that iodine. I don't remember her name. I think it was Jessica. I think it's Jessica. She supplemented randomly with iodine and felt amazing. So if anybody's wondering, you know, energy wise, that could be a great thing. Because to your point, our soil, that's a whole nother topic, but soil is really not great right now. Now, what if somebody has either, they keep losing weight, you know, or they have plateaued? They're two different things, right? But what lever are we going to play with to, let's say, drop more weight or to pause the weight loss? I would assume it's fat.
It depends. And so there's a big, especially in the southern United States, where obesity is just rampant. People have come up to me at conferences and said, you know, I had to quit keto or I had to quit carnivore because I was losing too much weight. Now, a lot of people, when somebody says something like that, they just take that at face value. They don't dig into that. But you can't do that in modern society. You've got to dig into everything. And so I'm like, okay, how tall are you? They tell me. How much do you weigh right now? Okay. How much did you weigh when you were afraid you were losing too much weight? And invariably, it turns out that they were not losing too much weight. Maybe they were losing too much weight for their mama, right? That because their mama like, you look skinny, you need to eat a biscuit. But what I'm talking about is their ideal body weight, their ideal body fat percentage. What they were doing was they were approaching an ideal body fat percentage with that weight that was losing too much weight. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so when you actually plot that, either on a BMI or a waist to height, or just do a DEXA scan, they were actually just getting to the sweet spot of healthiness. Because fat people are so ubiquitous. I used to be one, so I get to say that.
I was too.
Yeah, we get to say that. Fat people are everywhere, and you get used to seeing that. And then when you see somebody that is truly an ideal body size for a human being, what do they look like? They look too skinny.
Yeah.
Like here in the South, we'll say they look methy. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah,
like
wow.
They must be smoking meth. Well, look how methy they look.
They look
But that's
messy.
actually, if you went back in time to 1890s, 1850s,
Yeah.
that would be a normal size human. But now, you know, we're like the people on the spaceship in Wall-E. We're so freaking fat that looks normal. Everybody looks that way. So when you come out looking like a normal human should look, you look sick. You look, oh, you're something wrong. You're smoking something. So first of all, it's that perception. You got to dig into that and make sure, were you truly losing too much weight, or did your mama just think you needed to eat a biscuit?
Right.
That's a big difference, right? Now the other side of the coin is, I've stopped losing weight, can't seem to lose more weight. What's going on? So there's many different causes for this, and there's medical reasons, there's psychosocial reasons, and there's also dietary reasons. But if you're on a diet, which one are you going to blame? It's the diet. I'm doing something wrong with the diet. You're not going to think, well, I have undiagnosed Hashimoto's, or I have an undiagnosed adrenal condition, or I have undiagnosed low testosterone, or any number of the medical conditions that could cause your weight loss just to turn off.
Okay.
And then there's all the stress with work and the spouse and the 3 boyfriends and the whatever that you're chronically stressed. You're not going to be able to lose much weight if you're a certain type of person. Now, some people get thin as a rail under that kind of stress, right? Because they're the opposite of a stress eater. But the other half of the people are going to get fluffy with that kind of stress because they're stress eaters and they do inappropriate things to cope with the stress. And so what I tell people is I don't even want you to call it a weight loss stall until you haven't lost any weight on the scale or inches by the tape for 3 months. You're not allowed to call it a weight loss stall. I've stalled. No. Has it been 3 months? You haven't lost any inches in 3 months? You haven't lost not a half pound of weight in 3 months? then you officially get to call it a stall. And then we start looking at the medical reasons, the psychosocial reasons, and the other reasons why that could be happening. Now, invariably, when we talk about the diet part of it, invariably what's happened is carbohydrate creep, especially for people on ketovore, is that the carbohydrate intake has crept back up. And it's that incremental little thing that we were talking about earlier with human nature, right? It happens to all of us. We cannot avoid it. And so you're like, well, I'm just going to have a couple of little Lily's chocolate chips, just a couple of them, right? It's just tiny, right? And so you do that, and then you're like, well, three's not, that's, and then four, it's not that. I mean, it's just a little more. They're tiny. Did I tell you they're tiny, right? And so before you know it, you're having a handful of Lily's chocolate chips every day, and you don't remember you started out with two. And so that's carbohydrate creep. You got to count those carbs, whether you're consciously aware of them or not. The same goes for the carbs in fruit and honey and vegetables and every other thing that contains carbohydrates. If your carbohydrate intake has crept up, you may not be consciously aware, but your body, your physiology damn well knows it, and it's accounting for that. And it's either storing fat if you're eating too many carbs, or if you're eating just enough carbohydrate to keep your insulin bumped up above where it needs to be for weight loss, you're just turning off your weight loss. You can't lose the weight.
Something that I've experienced myself is, man, if you take a break from anything that's been cooked for you, let's say at restaurants, where I work, it's a large company. It's about 15,000, and then it's international. And they, I've never had this before. They cook breakfast and lunch for you, which is nice. It's really nice. Yeah, I'm like, okay. But I'm finding I don't know that I can actually eat it because I cook at home, bacon, eggs, tallow, and I don't get anything but that. When I go and I eat at these places that they're cooking, I don't know what they're cooking it in, I'm inevitably hungrier. I can eat 2 to 3 times what I would normally eat in a day. It's like food is on my mind 6 times more than it would be if I just cooked at home. And I am certain, maybe I'm wrong, but in my mind, I'm certain it's the seed oils and the linoleic acid.
Could be. Absolutely could be.
Yeah.
Could be any number of things. Anytime a chef is involved, they want their food to taste amazing.
Sugar, yeah.
And that's right. And so anything you cook, if you add a pinch of sugar, it's gonna open the flavor and it's gonna make it taste better. That's why there's sugar in steak sauce, because it opens up the flavor of the sauce and therefore the steak. Chefs know that. They're going to put a little pinch of sugar in everything. Kale, pinch of sugar. So everything gets a pinch of sugar, if not more. And yeah, that's going to bump that insulin up. That's going to spur your hunger hormones. And here we go, especially with the food just sitting there at the office. It's just sitting right there. Nobody's eating it. Why not get a few more? And then also we blend into that the sociality of eating.
Yeah.
You just tend to eat more when you see other people eating. It spurs your appetite and it continues your appetite. Where at home, you're like, I'm eating my 4 burger patties and 3 eggs and I'm done. That's it. That's all I need. Because at home, you're just thinking about nutrition.
What is the standard amount of food one should eat in the day? And I wanted to even add to that further. It seems that you also don't believe in the calories in, calorie out thing that we've been taught.
Yeah, the calorie in, calorie out thing is fatally wounded.
Yeah.
You can never accurately estimate the amount of calories that you're taking in a day. It is an unknowable number. You would need 3 or 4 biochemists and a lab to evaluate everything you ate before you ate it. And so the closest you can come is plus or minus 20%. You just can't know for sure, because every avocado is different, every hamburger patty is different, every strawberry is different, right? And even with the processed food, you would think that they had that down to such a science that if a pack of Frosty Mini Wheats says it's got this many calories, then that's how many it's got. No, plus or minus 20%. Then secondly, how many calories do you burn a day? How many do you need? That's also an incalculable number. You can never know that number plus or minus 30%. Mm-hmm. If you've got 1/2 degree of fever, that changes the equation. If you're sitting in a chair versus standing, if the room is 70 degrees instead of 69 or 71, every one of those things changes the equation. right? Do you have just a touch of Hashimoto's, but not too much? Totally throws the equation into upheaval. It's literally an unknowable number. And we've obviously established, just as a common sense just a measure, counting calories is not worth a damn.
Yeah.
Just look at everybody, right? How many millions
Yeah.
of books sold that tell you a Wendy's single with cheese that's got this many calories. How many millions of books have sold?
Yeah.
We're still off that. So obviously it's not good on a practical level, but also when you get into the theoretical part, it's an unknowable, incalculable number. And so the question is, how much food should somebody eat? Well, I think that we have this very complex biochemical machine built into our body that will tell us how much food we need to eat each day if we're eating proper human diet food.
Right.
It's a very sophisticated instrument, and it takes years. You have to have a PhD to operate it. Actually, you don't. It's called your tongue, okay? Your tongue and your hunger. Once you're keto adapted, which means you can cycle in and out of ketosis effortlessly, and you don't have that adjustment period, right? Once that you understand, okay, these things are foods that humans have had access to for more than 15,000 years. We've been eating this shit a long damn time. Mm-hmm. But that stuff over there, we've only been eating that for 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years. That's not real human food. Once you can make that differentiation and then realize that humans are by definition a low carbohydrate mammal. If you feed us more than 100 total grams of carbs a day, we're going to get fat, either slowly or quickly, depending on the person. When you get all those things under your belt, then you say, okay, am I hungry? If the answer is yes, then begin eating. Eat until you're full. Then stop eating. And then don't eat again until you get truly hungry again. That literally works for you if you're back in a natural, wild environment that our ancestors would have been in. Right. Just like every other wild animal in the world does, unless it has access to human garbage. The same goes for salt. How much salt should I eat? Salt your food to taste. Does it taste good? That's enough salt. Does it need more salt? Is it too salty? That's your answer. How much water should I drink? Are you thirsty? Then drink water. Are you not thirsty? You don't need to drink water. There is no amount. These things are incalculable. There are gurus all over the damn internet that'll tell you a number. Tell me your height and your age and your body frame and your activity level, and I'll tell you how many ounces of water. That's all bullshit.
It's so hard for people to conceptually understand that you don't have to count calories on this because back to profit, it's been sold to us otherwise. And it's been buy this cracker that's only has this X amount of calories and this many carbs and it's keto, air quotes, and it's like.
Right. And then if you take carbs away from them, they immediately try to count something else. I'm going to weigh my salt. I'm going to count how many ounces of water. I'm going to count carbs. I'm going to count this. I'm going to count that. Yeah. And the vast majority of that stuff is busy work that we've been trained that we should do. But in reality, you don't have to do those things.
It's also much more energetic than we give it credit for, in my opinion. Our body knows what to do. If we just let it reset, it'll figure it out for the most part.
Absolutely.
Hormones are affected. Our sleep affects how hungry we feel and how full we feel. The seed oils affects all that stuff too. I mean, it's so much more than what we've been sold in all these different ways. And it brings me back to when I was like a little kid and I just couldn't figure out why I was always so damn hungry like all the time. So then you end up starving yourself because you don't want to be fat and you don't get why you're just hungry all the time. And so that's the only answer. And then that ties back to anxiety, depression, whatever, right? And it's just all so much more energetic than everything that we've been sold. So I just have one or two more questions. Can carnivore help epilepsy?
If it's high fat enough. So we've known since the 1920s that a diet very, very high in fat and very low in carbohydrates could actually be a therapeutic intervention for epilepsy, for seizure disorders. This has been well established in the literature. Then here comes the big pharmaceutical companies, and we kind of forgot about that because here's a pill for seizures, here's 2 pills, 5 pills, 10 pills. So we kind of forgot about the diet, but that literature is still there, and it's been rediscovered, and now we know that. And so many people, when they hear carnivore, they think, oh, it's high protein, moderate fat, right? Very zero carb. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. And if someone has a seizure disorder, it probably doesn't need to be that way because that's not going to be high fat enough to get them deep enough into ketosis to prophylactically prevent the seizures. And so I have several people in our private group who have seizure disorder and they follow a very high fat carnivore diet and they haven't had a seizure in years. And they're not currently not taking any medicine. And one of these guys used to take 5 pills a day every day to take care of his almost intractable seizure disorder. And now he just eats a very high fat carnivore diet. He eats till he's full. He eats delicious foods. And he goes out and plays because he's not having a seizure.
That's incredible. Okay, well, I will be following up with you on just thanking you really for your time on this, Ken. It's been incredible. And everybody, if you haven't read Lies My Doctor Told Me, you have to read it. It's just an incredible book that shows so much truth behind what's going on. And Ken is obviously the author. So thank you for that. And thank you for everything else you do. It's kind of a, it's a new path and it's all you're forging it for a lot of us. And we really appreciate it. Where can people find you, Ken?
So I've got a little YouTube channel that I now have over 700 videos, I think, on my YouTube channel.
Growing.
And so the way people use it is they just go to YouTube and type in Dr. Berry and then whatever condition or medication or diet or intervention. So Dr. Berry hypertension, Dr. Berry fatty liver, and that'll find my videos because sometimes I have 4, 5, or 6 on the same topic. If I'm feeling especially helpful and loving, I'll be on Instagram or Facebook. If I'm feeling especially combative, I'll be on Twitter. So just whatever mood you're in, that's probably where I'll be. I've got a new book called Common Sense Labs that basically tells you the labs you need to have checked. And then also not only what the normal range is, but what's the optimal range. And then also strategies to talk your doctor into checking these labs because many doctors don't know what they mean and they're hesitant to order them. And then I'm working on a couple of other books as well in the background that are not ready yet, but will be one day.
Oh, I'm excited to read them. Thank you. Thank you again, Ken. Say hi to Nisha as well and thank you to her for her work. And we'll talk soon.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.